We're with Johanna Blakley from the University of Southern California, and she submitted a wonderful paper called Technologies of Taste. I was really struck by this paper, and so was the whole guest editorial board of IEEE Technology and Society magazine for the guest edited issue of Unintended Consequences, because it somehow brought primary research into the grasp of everyday lay people. Johanna, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about your paper?
Yes, I attended the TED conference a few years ago and heard Eli Pariser, the man who created Move On, talk about his most recent book, which was called Filter Bubbles. And now it's become quite a concept that I think you see in mainstream press. And it was really about the danger of algorithms online that sort through and limit the search results that we discover on various platforms, including on Google. So when this first became a concept that was broadly known to the general public, people reacted with anger and fear. You know, I'm getting certain results, my friend is getting a different result. That means that we're going to be boxed in to a certain worldview and a certain perspective on the world that is artificially put upon us. And so I thought this was a very interesting concept. It resonated with some research, some survey research that we had done here at the Lear Center a few years before about how it is that people's entertainment and media habits can be predicted by their political ideology. And so I felt this might very well be the case, but my own personal experience had been that I had used recommendation engines to discover brand new things that I had never heard of before. And so I was just very curious to see what might be the underlying truth there about the social impact of these algorithms. And the results I found were quite counterintuitive. I found that mainstream media was not talking about recommendation engines as these mechanisms to try to increase people's purview, to encourage them to try new products and services. And that indeed turns out to be the commercial bottom line for these algorithms, which are used obviously by Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, Netflix, YouTube, you name it. Any sort of sophisticated service that offers many different products has tried to incorporate something like a recommendation engine in their system. So I felt this was a very interesting topic, certainly for me, and I'm very curious about how it's going to reshape our global culture.
I guess there's something to say about giving people more of what they want. You know, the old adage goes, you know, too much of a good thing is bad. What's your interpretation? Are these filter bubble engines or algorithms that cause filter bubbles, are they good or bad?
I think there's a net positive social effect for these engines, because what they try to do is pull into view what you would otherwise not see. So personally, my background, I grew up in a very small town where there were very few options in terms of entertainment or media. We had one radio station, so if you didn't like country music, then too bad. And if you didn't have money, you couldn't go visit the big city and see theater and plays and museums. So I felt horribly boxed in. There was no internet at the time. And once I was able to become acquainted with internet technology when I was doing my PhD, I realized how different my life would have been if I'd had the opportunity to see beyond the purview of my television set, which only had 4 channels on it, my radio, which had 1 channel, and my public library that I ransacked. I read everything there, and it still wasn't enough for my hungry mind. So my own personal experience puts me in a position to say that having the opportunity to discover new things that I wouldn't otherwise find through any sort of mechanism possible, whether it's on a commercial platform or not. And I think that's where a lot of social activists and critics of technology really hone in their critique, is that these are commercial platforms that are meant to make money for very large global multinational companies. And this is indeed the truth. But my sense is that the global social net impact is a very positive one.
I had a different experience growing up in the inner city of Sydney. My parents and my siblings and I, when I was about 8 years of age, went on this long trip to visit our cousins out in the farming rural areas of South Australia. And of course, what happened there is I got the one channel syndrome, or maybe two channels on the television set, and there was either the news playing 24/7 or we had cricket playing. And cricket is this interesting British/Australian game that's played that might take 5 days to complete, of course, between the hours of 9 to 5 p.m. Now, my siblings and I had older siblings, did not watch cricket. But what happened over that summer is we were either picking apricots from the trees or we were watching cricket. And I've now become a lifelong follower of cricket. So interestingly enough, it can work both ways, I guess. And that shows me that, we can pretty much put anything we want in front of somebody. And if it's the only choice they have, they'll end up either liking it because they have no other choice but to like it, or really hate it.
Yes, I ended up really hating all the options that were available to me in small town America. And so much of my fantasy life was really oriented around what I saw on television. Yes. And, you know, nobody in my family had ever had finished high school, let alone gone to college. So it was very interesting for me to see those depictions on television and to imagine myself in these roles that just did not exist in my hometown. So it was definitely a platform for imagining the future for myself.
Is that what drew you into the gaming industry? I know you have a background in gaming. Was that kind of role play, ability to immerse yourself in another character, in options, in paths going forward that were different? What drew you to gaming?
Oh, yes, it's very much the notion of simulation is what interests me the most. And my background before I worked at Vivendi Universal Games was getting a PhD in English and doing a very sort of high theory cultural studies curriculum. And so I was very interested in the ways in which representations help to reframe and reshape reality, and how it is that we can often get confused between the stories that we've heard and what's actually happening in the world. So I was very interested in any sort of technology, including the internet, that would somehow take advantage of that bleed between representation and reality, where you could, through digital means, actually have community and engagement. And on really sophisticated gaming platforms, of course, you can have an incredibly immersive experience that's very distant from your own. And I'm one of these humanities scholars who believes that if you expose people to compelling stories of other people's lives, there's a pretty good chance that you'll develop a kind of empathetic response to that scenario. And so I think there's some very sort of primeval biology at play here in our reptilian brains when we're given the opportunity to play roles and to simulate experiences in a safe frame of representation, that we do end up taking the lessons learned in that artificial space to our real lives.
I find it interesting. Many gaming users or end users, consumers, don't realize that they're being profiled while they're actually playing games. And traditionally, we had, thumbprints as biometrics, but now we have behavioral patterns in gaming to detect whether a user, for instance, with a certain avatar or identity, is getting somebody else to do a few hours extra for them throughout the night and sharing the same avatar. But the way we play a game has become a behavioral biometric now, where you can possibly be identified as unique as an individual based on your kill rate, based on how you strategically hide behind walls. And I'm wondering whether you think this is at all, I guess, suspicious in some kind of way.
Well, obviously, it raises huge privacy concerns. And that's been an issue that we've been concerned with at the Lear Center ever since we launched. At the Norman Lear Center, our mission is to look at the social impact of entertainment and media and try to figure out how we might harness the power of those forces to achieve some sort of social good. But the sort of underlying concept beneath our interest and focus on entertainment and media is that we see them as these mechanisms for gathering and holding attention. So we see the world, especially the industrialized first world, but really now every place on earth, as a place that could be better described as running by an attention economy than a monetary or currency-oriented economy. And so we've been very interested in how it is that you can protect and how it is that you can care for the attention that you're giving to various products, media platforms, because that's really the value of human existence these days, is where it is that we choose to focus our attention. From there, the money follows, the celebrity follows, the inventions follow. But if attention doesn't lie there, then there's nothing. And so we've explored different models of how it is that people monetize that attention, how people can reclaim their own attention. And I think it does now, of course, expand just beyond the visual. When we think about attention, we do tend to think of eyeballs, but it really is a full sensory kind of experience. And in the game world, it's particularly, I think, creepy to think about people being able to profile us by our instincts to move and behave in particular ways, and that's exactly the kind of example I think that could help bring this conversation to a higher level, and to get people to be a little more serious about it. Yeah,
I think the same is happening, Johanna, with interactive TVs like the Samsung TV, and the ability for it to listen in on the household, given it's Wi-Fi enabled, and you sign up after reading a 70-page document, of course, which tells you they may be testing your service and listening in no uncertain terms. So even your interaction within your own home could be monitored. And I'm very interested in the critics that talk about the filter bubble as providing a type of tunnel vision rather than broadening a depth and a horizon in areas of interest. It's rather manipulative and exploitive. And so I'm wondering, beyond the privacy concerns, do you see this as consumer manipulation in some ways?
Well, once again, there needs to be a lot more, to generally talk about it, media literacy. I think people have a very sort of primitive understanding of their rights vis-a-vis media, and of what they ought to be concerned about in terms of what they're giving up and what they're getting in return. That sort of exchange is one that goes quite often unanalyzed, or there's a knee-jerk response that doesn't really take into account the value that might have been provided to a consumer. So I think there needs to be a much more rational conversation about who's giving what and what's offered in return. But I think one thing that people have a really hard time sort of wrapping their minds around is the possibility of surveillance at every possible level of the Internet of Things. And I don't know how long it's going to take for people to be able to engage in a meaningful way in that conversation. I could see a lot of people just being motivated by fear and stopping at that point. But I think there are obviously a lot of really amazing uses to which this kind of surveillance technology could be used, but it has to be an opt-in kind of situation or scenario. That is just, it's as if we need an institutional review board, you know, for human subjects research, inscribed into all kinds of new technology endeavors. And I think that also is a trend within technology now, is that people who are developing apps who might have thought of them as lifestyle apps could actually market them as medical apps if they wanted to, because it's actually changing the way our bodies are operating. And so our legal structures and oversight just are so far behind the curve on technological development that it's going to create some serious ethical problems for society quite generally writ large.
Yes. Tell us, walk us through the paper in methodology. I mean, you look at things like political beliefs, and you look at people's viewing of Netflix choices. Could you walk us through and perhaps tell us what they say about everyday consumers and how this data might be used.
Oh, are you talking about the survey research that we did on politics and ideology, the methodology for that? Because that was
Yes.
quite separate from the Netflix research, which was much more a literature review, just to sort of figure out what the state of the art is in recommendation engines. But the primary research that we did in-house was really to test out a hypothesis. If we knew somebody's entertainment preferences, would we be able to predict their political ideology, and vice versa? It was clear from our review of the literature that there certainly were these kinds of data sets that already existed, that had been put together mostly by political campaigns who were trying to figure out where it is that they should place their ads. But that data was never made public, and those methods are never made public. I still haven't seen one that's been released to the general public. And so we decided that we would do one that would be available to everyone, to any academic that wanted to use it. And also we would sort of drum up some interest by doing it during one of the presidential campaigns. And so we focused on the survey, the subset of our survey population that didn't fit neatly in these categories that we tend to call red and blue in the United States, the liberals and the conservatives, the Democrats and the Republicans. It was a full 24% of our sample that did not fall neatly into those groups. And we didn't predetermine how many groups we were looking for in our data set. We did K-cluster analysis in order to see if any coherent groups emerged, and we were quite shocked to find that there were 3. And so we really focused our research on that 24% in the middle, so to speak. And it was pretty frightening, actually, to see the characteristics of this group. They felt very disenfranchised. They felt like they didn't know enough about politics in order to be able to say what they really believe or what party they properly belong to. And they tended to be female. And so we found it fascinating that that doesn't tend to be the public conversation about the most important voters in our country. That they tend to be these women who are concerned that they are not knowledgeable enough and are not, I think, people who deserve to be members of the public sphere making these kinds of choices.
Oh, yes.
So.
People who have a lot of primary carer responsibilities, for instance, mothers, executive female employees, etc. So I think you're very right. And that was 1/3 of the portion, is that correct? 25%.
Oh, yeah, about a quarter, just under a quarter.
Yeah. So I guess in the hands of politicians, this data would be quite incredible, although we suspect we already know that, we already think that they know this stuff. Is that true?
Yes, as cable television became more of a slice of the advertising pie for political campaigns, the more data that they needed to know about that fragmented audience. So that's when we started sort of hearing about some very sophisticated survey research going on within campaigns to figure out whether it was worth buying a spot on the Golf Channel instead of buying a much more expensive spot on CBS Evening News if you weren't going to reach any swing voters there. So those were the kinds of calculations, and they found that making niche media buys was a much more economical way to reach very specific audiences. Are you there? There we go.
Yes, I just lost you. Can you repeat that last bit? So they found?
Oh, they found that making lots of niche media buys on channels like the Golf Channel instead of on CBS News was a much more economical way to target a more specific audience.
Yes, and we could, you know, we all know about how Obama really got on the social media bandwagon very early in that 2008 election and really changed the dynamics. I've looked at papers that have represented, you know, how much viewing time, you know, in terms of minutes that the candidates received by everyday citizens. So it's fascinating, whether it's YouTube social media or Twitter social media. He really honed in with his campaign team to figure out where those swing voters were actually. Johanna, going back to the article and what you found in terms of the Netflix influence, can you talk to us about that?
About the Netflix what?
Influence and recommendation engines.
Oh. Well, we didn't do any sort of influence study, but what we did instead was take a look at what the algorithm was trying to achieve. And it was very clear from the beginning that when Netflix held a giant international contest to improve the accuracy of its algorithm, that means that once people were recommended a film, they would give it a positive rating rather than a negative rating once they viewed it, which would suggest that the recommendation was accurate, that they felt that there was a direct correlation between the accuracy of the algorithm and the likelihood that people would keep subscribing. And so this could save them up to $500 million a year if they could just avoid 1% of cancellations. And since 50 to 75% of the views on Netflix are garnered from the recommendation engine, they won't release the real numbers. Netflix sits on all of its data. It's very rare that they release any reports. Then you could tell that this is a huge part of their business model. And all you had to do was sort of figure out, well, what is the algorithm trying to accomplish? And what it's trying to do is to keep people addicted to Netflix. And even though it seems like there's a million options for films out there, there actually aren't. There's a limited number in each subgenre and a limited number that were made by your favorite actor or my favorite director. And so they need to make sure that we have a hunger and a desire to watch movies that are well beyond the purview of our film and cinematic experience and that of our friends. So this was the problem that they meant to solve. And I just find it so fascinating. I wish I could look at some of the profiles, of course, to see how people have been nudged beyond Korean martial arts dramas, right, to Korean soap operas, to Japanese telenovelas, to, you know, I just want to see what sort of route people end up taking through these recommendation systems. I think it would be a fascinating way to sort of map out human taste, which is really ultimately the object of our research here. I'd say that was ultimately the object of our survey research too. We're trying to figure out whether we could map human taste.
That's fascinating. I mean, my husband and I have quoted very often Bruce Springsteen's song, 52 channels and there's nothing on. But I know that it's a perception of choice. And like you say, there's a limited choice, although we see all of these options and all of these channels and genres, and we think, wow, you know, thousands of options to us tonight. What am I going to choose? And why do we choose what we choose to watch with our friends, families, and so forth? Interestingly also is your comment about the potential for stickiness drivers. This is what it's called in customer relationship management from operational background view. It's what makes the customer a repeat visitor, and also after they've watched one, you know, documentary or film, how can they watch a second and a third and a fourth? And it shouldn't be too good for us, should it, that we are being coerced somehow subliminally to be sitting on that chair. Although on a Saturday night you might like to watch a couple of movies back to back, but I know people in Australia who would tell me, you know, the minute they get through the door, they'll change out of their work clothes, sit on the couch with a nice drink, and just watch Netflix and surf. And that's all they do until they go to sleep. And they do this the next day and the next day after that. And I'm sure it's a great life, but are we missing out on physical activities as a result of these new services on demand?
Well, I haven't seen the most recent research on this. I'm not quite sure what the trade-offs are between tech uptake and physical exercise, but I have seen some very interesting studies about the social side effects of being somebody who uses technology a great deal. And all the studies that I've seen, most of them are from the MacArthur Foundation here in the United States. have said that there is a direct relationship between one's use of smartphone technology and increased social life. So the more you use your smartphone, the more likely it is that you have more friends and that you have more social occasions. I've also seen a really interesting piece of research that compared a bunch of video that was collected around public places in New York, including on the steps of the library. And then they set up that this was from 30 years ago, where they shot this video just to see how people coalesced and whether people were in groups or alone pre-smartphone technology. Then they did it more recently, a couple years ago, shooting in the exact same locations, exact times of day, to see if people were less or more social who had smartphones. And it turned out that people who had smartphones were far more likely to be meeting up with larger groups of people, and
Yes.
they were far less likely to be alone ultimately. And this is always kind of a shock. It's like, wait a second, but this is the thing we complain about, you know, that the phone is somehow isolating us from other people. But quite often the activity that we're doing on the phone is a very social one. Texting, using WhatsApp, using Facebook, it's quite social.
Yes.
And so I've always found it ironic that people felt that these devices were somehow alienating us from one another, when it seems that the data represents exactly the opposite case.
So what do you think is required to dispel these myths in your eyes?
Well, I think it's a generational thing. I think it's less likely that young people will say, oh yeah, if I didn't have my phone, I'd have a lot more friends. I know they would feel differently from that. They feel like they have more social engagement with their peers now because of this device. And whenever it's stripped away from them, they're so angry because what they've lost is their social group. So it is a perfect punishment, that's for sure. But I think it's an older generation, especially a sort of interstitial generation like ours, I would say, that didn't have it at one point and has it now. And there are side effects that we don't enjoy. There are things that we got used to and a way of interacting with people that was standard as we were growing up. And as those kinds of social mores are are stomped upon, really, in many different social contexts, that can't help but be annoying. And I think also we have a history as humans of being nostalgic for a previous time that wasn't necessarily better, but was known to us. No.
I do think taking away phones or tablets is the perfect punishment, and not because I've employed that strategy on my own children, but I've seen it as I've traveled throughout different parts of the world, including China, where there may be 200 students in a foundation year before they enter and matriculate through to university, and the teachers and the TESOL and TOEFL examiners and tutors will say to me, barring a student for an hour from the device is like putting them in the worst kind of isolation. And I say to them, so why do you do it? And they respond because they say that's the only way this student will pass. So while there are lessons going on and the students should be learning English, or the students should be participating in activities in class, they're so immersed into the virtual space, and often it looks social, but they're actually staring into a blue screen and perhaps being stuck or addicted in some form to be looking at information that is recommended to them one after the other, and all of a sudden they've really not paid attention to anything that's been said in class, and they aren't interacting with their peers or their parents or friends outside the university. So it's interesting to see different dynamics in different cultures, and I think there is more observation required of people who are immersed and cannot actually put down the handset or the screen, whatever form that takes, whether it's a television, tablet, or smartphone, for the very purposes that they're being driven by a hunger and yearning to read and look at and interact with something that they love, which is not a bad thing. Learning is not a bad thing, except they're not learning the structured way and the way that will get them to the next milestone. But it's very interesting to see this contention in different contexts, and I have to say it's contextual. It's very much contextual, and I think the MacArthur study is likely right. The new children's playground is a screen of some form interacting with another person virtually. I don't discount that people that use their smartphone more most likely will end up meeting more people in the physical space. But I do think it's taking away potentially from quality engagements that would have possibly taken form in an outdoor setting or an indoor setting with a family member. So often we rush away to interact with a non-family member, whereas traditionally we would have been encapsulated and encouraged, because that was the only means. Just going back to your initial description of growing up in a small town, you know, obviously you would have had to go outside to meet somebody other than your family, for instance, unless they visited your home. So the whole social landscape has changed. The way we interact with our physical landscape has changed. And I agree with you, the way we interact with one another has changed. But I think the jury is still out, whether for some people it's a positive, beneficial learning and anticipation, and for others it could be an addictive struggle as such.
Oh yeah, I think there's absolutely a very small minority of people who suffer addictive problems with media. I went to a conference on this topic. It was absolutely fascinating. But it is a pretty small subgroup. I think the rest who are using it in antisocial ways, which is a very large proportion of the population generally, are once again people who are suffering from a lack of media literacy. They don't understand the ethics and the proper etiquette around use of digital technology, especially smartphones and mobile. So I really believe that's more of a social training is the problem. I see it among adult friends of mine who have to be chastised because they just don't know how to control themselves. They don't understand how rude it is, their activity. And I think the other problem that I do not know why people don't seem to be more aware of all this research is that our brains are incapable of multitasking. But especially a younger generation, I think, believes it's entirely possible. Yeah. And so once they can be sort of shown that that's not the case at all, I think it might become a little more apparent to them that just how rude their behavior is and how it doesn't serve their learning goals. You know, if they're trying to multitask, you know, in a classroom or on a conference call, as I see a lot of workers doing. And so I really wish that people were much more self-conscious and aware of the impact of the attention that they pay to their digital devices, because I think they think that it can be entirely supplementary, right? That it's not a zero-sum game, but unfortunately attention is a zero-sum game.
That's a beautiful, I think, direction and a positive way to finish this interview is are you suggesting, Johanna, that we start to provide media literacy when children, for example, are first exposed to screens of some sort from a young age of maybe 1 even or 2 years of age?
Absolutely. I mean, they should be treating it as the important object it is, one of the most important and most complex objects in their lives. And that's just not generally the way that I think a lot of parents are regarding it. Instead, it's a convenient babysitter. It's a distraction device. It's something that just gets them out of their hair. It's perfectly safe if the programming is good. But to not have an understanding of how it's working and how we interact with these things, how we connect with them, is very dangerous, I think. And we've seen the problems, the sort of impact of the lack of training around television and what it did to a generation of people. So, so I think media literacy is absolutely crucial to this, and also something higher level than just for children, but even within the college curriculum, I think it's important that you tackle the more complex issues around authorship in digital media, understanding what's socially acceptable, that you should not promote any articles that you have not read, that you need to read through, that you have to take a responsibility for being a broadcaster, basically. And so this is often what I end up talking about in the classes that I teach. And these are to master's level students. So.
Yes, indeed. You remind me so much of another contributor to the Technology and Society magazine. That's Isabel Peterson from UOIT in Canada. She's also an English literature major in background. She did her PhD on wearables of all things. But I'd love to get the both of you in touch and communicating and reading. Yeah, she's a fantastic wealth of knowledge like yourself. So Johanna, Are there any final comments you wanted to end the interview with?
No, I get very excited about conversations and places where people have a chance to talk about the culture of digital technology. It's one of my favorite things to explore, and I feel like there's just not enough conversation about it. So I'm so thrilled to have a chance to publish in this journal and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for the contribution. Publish again with us. It's a really, really interesting paper, and I encourage our audience to have a read in the March issue of 2017. So we look forward to that about 9 months ahead. Thank you so much, Johanna.
Thank you.
Take care and have a lovely day.
Yes, you too.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.